Hi, welcome back to this third video, and we're looking at the mechanics of the interview, part 3 and part 4. And the purpose of these videos is not to cover everything in detail. We do not have time, but I'll cover some of the main points that you need to know. And what I'm going to do in this part 3, mechanics of the interview, is go over in a little bit more detail assessment questions here. We're going to look at admission seeking questions, and then finally refute alibis. But before we do that, I just want you to be aware you're in the interview. You need to be aware of different cues that are being given by the interviewee. So you need to think about whether the interactions are less positive. You need to think about verbal and non-verbal cues. You need to think about their less forthcoming responses, the increased tension, maybe to the stage where you are detecting deception. And that's when you might need to undertake a different path. You may need to pivot and undertake assessment questions. And so in the next slide, I'm going to look at assessment questions because you believe that they are displaying dishonesty in their answers. So you need to pivot back and ask questions to find out how dishonest the interviewee is being. Then we're going to look at admission seeking questions. And then we're going to look at the refute alibis. Okay. The mechanics of interview assessment questions. Assessment questions are more non-sensitive questions with respect to the interviewee and their position in the organization, and much more general to the role that they're in or to the role of what is acceptable moral behavior in society, just to get the interviewee in that train of thought to agree that humans should behave in a particular way. Don't you think it's right that the auditors should report any discrepancies in the internal controls if they find them? What do you think? And, oh yeah, of course they should. And you're trying to get agreement that way. And this is a way of desensitizing the interview, moving away from the sensitive questions where you believe that they were being dishonest, bringing them back to trying to agree with you about what they believe to be an honest person and their behavior in the organization. So in the textbook, they talk about interview assessment questions and examples of that. Next, admission seeking questions. This is where you are trying to get them to admit to what they have done and why they have done it. And you could start by saying, well, I can imagine that given the way that the senior management are excessively spending on themselves the profits of the organization, and they don't seem to pass on those profits to employees, I can imagine how employees can become despondent in this organization and not feel totally engaged in their work in the organization. What do you think? And you try to get the interviewee, who's an employee, to think, oh, yeah, it's just unbelievable what the management are doing. And then you might lead to a more sensitive question and say, I could just imagine if there were opportunities for inventory to be removed from the warehouse on particular days, that employees feeling less engaged might actually take that chance to take inventory. What do you think? Yeah, that's quite possible too. And so you're trying to talk about elements of theft act opportunities that are totally rational to justify because of the way employees are treated in the organization. Like, you're a friend and a colleague of this interviewee, and you try to get them to be comfortable with the fact that if they had undertaken that theft act, and maybe because you have the evidence, you have the physical evidence, you're trying to get them to admit and across the confession line here. All right. So you already know that they've done it. you just want them to admit and confess that they have done it. And so one way is to get them to think and to be comfortable with the rationalization that they have been going through for the last few weeks or the last few months since they stole inventory, since they siphoned money from the organization. And you could look at any of these areas of rationalization and try and mirror their feeling in the process. Because you want to get them to admit, because if you can get them to admit, you don't have to take them to court so much. What I mean is you get them to confess, then it's easier to get a civil case done, and you don't have to worry about going through lots of evidence in the court if you get them to the confession stage, because it's more likely you can get a settlement outside of court. It's more likely you can get a settlement with an insurance company without going to court. And so that's the reason why you want to invest in trying to get an admission by the culprit and get them across the confession line. The final area of this part 3 is to try and refute alibis. If they still deny, the last straw to get the accused over the confession line, to get them to admit what they have done and why they have done it, is, well, I've got physical evidence here. We have witnesses. We have a confession from someone else. We have you on video. Sorry. Okay, so you're actually refuting their denials. You're refuting their reluctance to admit, their reluctance to confess. Would you like to change your version of events? Because we have this evidence here. Wow. So this is the last straw. So you don't bring the other evidence until you've failed to get them to voluntarily admit and confess. So we're going on to part 4 of the mechanics of the interview. So there's a lot to digest here. Remember, part 1 was all introductory. It was setting the stage, the strategy. All right. Part 2 was understanding nonverbal communications, going from non-sensitive to sensitive, dealing with difficult people. Part 3 was all about going through stages of trying to get the interviewee to admit their wrongdoing, to confess. And now we're going to that confession stage. And this is where you need to get them to sign a statement. This is where you need to make sure there are key points in the signed statement. This is where you need to be specific about each offence. And maybe you need to have a signed statement for each offence. And so the specifics of each offence, once the major hurdles are overcome, interviewers then return to the specifics of each offence. So generally, you start with the first instance and work through chronologically in a logical fashion, because these questions are information seeking. They should be openly phrased so the answer is independent of the question. The answer is not just a yes or no. The physical evidence, regardless of how limited it may be, should be obtained from the perpetrators or confessions. In many instances, illicit income from fraud is deposited directly into their bank accounts. Interviewers typically want to ask confessors to voluntarily surrender their banking records for review. All right. So it's not only important to get a confession, you already understand that they've admitted, they've confessed, but also you need to get more information about physical evidence, because you need to try and get money back. All right. The confession will help you get money from the insurance. That confession may help you get a settlement on the court, but you still need to get closure in terms of where did the money go? Where did the inventory go? All right. Where you need to get closure on the physical elements of the theft act and not just the human elements of the theft act. So that's why we have this notion of make sure you get information in the statement about physical evidence, about where it is, and that you get the confessor to voluntarily surrender their banking records for review. When we have a signed statement, then the wording needs to be precise, and ideally, you should have two people witness the signing of a statement in case it's refuted later on. Maybe they said, oh, I signed it under duress, and then under US law, then it's not admissible into a court proceeding. All right. So it's very important that confessions are voluntary and there is evidence that they are voluntary. So having two people to witness the signing of the statement can help go a long way to shore up the validity of the confession. So we're near the end of this final video and part 3 and part 4. We now need to go to honesty testing, and that is basically how we get information from another human. The best way to get it is through the interview, which we talked about in chapter 10 in these series of videos. Pencil and paper tests can help, and also graphology can help, as you realized in that Nina Wang case in the last learning module, where they brought graphologists in to do expert witnessing on the signature of the 2006 will and testament. Voice stress analysis and polygraphs are another way of trying to elicit honesty statements from interviewees, although they are limited into when they can be used and cannot be used. And last but not least is the fraud report. Now, I'm not going into detail about how to write all the elements, but chapter 10 briefly provides the current structure. That is the findings, the conclusions, the recommendations, corrective actions taken, and the tone. It needs to be objective, factual, unbiased, and free from distortion. So there you have it, the fraud report and the end of our approach to fraud investigation, where we covered in chapter 10 the reaction to crisis, and that is the demeanor of the interviewee, planning an interview and elements of communication, the mechanics of the interview, honesty testing, and fraud reports. Wow, a lot to digest, but the main thing I want you to take away is that this has all the hallmarks of having a strategic plan, having an operational approach to the sequencing of questioning, the thematic grouping of questioning over time or areas of the organization, and thinking about logically organizing the questioning in terms of being non-sensitive to sensitive, dealing with difficult and volatile interviewees, and dealing with the final stages of the interview, assuming that your interviewee is the perpetrator in question, and that is getting them to admit and getting them to confess, getting them across the confession finish line, which would be the ideal objective and to bring closure to your fraud investigation. Last but not least, we looked at honesty testing and very briefly what a fraud report would consist of. This is O'Connor. Thank you for tuning into chapter 10, the longest chapter in the textbook. See you in the class. Bye for now.